great pleasure to introduce Juliette to you tonight, and I have to share this. It's not usually something I would talk about, but I just have to. The first time Juliette came here to the library, it was in the off-season, and it was it was either my first year or my second year here, so I was all ambitious and trying to do programs all year long, and like one person showed up, and then a family came in, and that family was going through a lot of pain and problems. And Juliette, I've never seen such an instinctive switch. She focused on the family. It was one of the kindest actions I've ever seen. We sort of had a salon here. We sort of had like an informal discussion. And it was so quick and so instinctive and so gracious that I have been your #1 fan since then. I have had my eye on you. And I've been wanting you to do very well and successful, and I will never forget it. It's great to meet these talented, wonderful people, but it's even better when you realize that they're wonderful on the inside and emotionally. So, and Juliette is another Boston girl. She went to Boston College and Harvard, although I think she was born in New York. Yankee fan or Red Sox fan? Red Sox, of course. And she has. I've read most of her books, and they're wonderful. And I have not read the newest one, though. I cannot wait. But her characters are kind of like her. It's a world. It's gracious. It's a the Tumbling Turner Sisters is a great coming of age book if you have someone of that age to buy for. They're kind of female oriented, but they kind of remind me of that book Brooklyn by Colm Tobin. Yeah, it's just good people doing good things, but not in a sicky sweet way. Just very understandable and very, very good. So, anyways, it is my great pleasure to introduce Juliette Fay.
Okay, so now I have to live up to that introduction. Wow, that really is probably the nicest introduction I've ever received. So thank you so much, Tricia. And thank you to the Truro Library for hosting me here tonight. I'm thrilled to be here. I had a great day on the beach today, so I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but I did get some nice beach time. So I am just going to talk a little bit about how I came to write The City of Flickering Light, sort of the facts and scandals and stories behind the story, and then we'll just open it up for questions and anything that you want to ask me about, the book, my writing career, my personal life, anything. No, not really. But I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have. So I should say that I kind of stumbled onto the silent movie industry with a little bit of an attitude. I had been researching my previous novel, which is The Tumbling Turner Sisters, as Tricia said, and that's about a family with 4 daughters. They're facing eviction, and they decide that the best way to not get kicked out of their house is to go on the road and make money as a traveling acrobatic act in vaudeville. It's set in 1919, and vaudeville, for those of you who don't know, was basically a variety show. So 7 to 15 unconnected acts, anything that could be remotely interesting or entertaining, singers, dancers, comedians, contortionists, animal tricks, regurgitators. Not kidding, they regurgitated things. That was apparently highly entertaining. It really had its heyday from the 1880s through about the end of the 1920s. And part of what caused the demise of vaudeville was the movie industry. And I came to love vaudeville so much, I did so much research on it and came to love it so much, I was really a little bit ticked off about this, even though it happened long before I was born. It was sort of like anger from a previous life, but it felt pretty real. Silent movies, come on, they're silent. The stories are primitive, the acting is hammy. This is 1921's The Chic. I just saw you say that, The Chic. Rudolph Valentino and Agnes Ayres. Rudolph Valentino, this is the movie, The Chic, that put Rudolph Valentino into the hearts and fantasies of women across America. Swoon. So silent movies have no words, and I'm clearly a person who likes words. But you're doing serious writerly research on the internet, and you stumble across something. Oh, this is interesting. What's this? Oh, nice dress. Colleen Moore. Who's she? She's a silent movie star. Suddenly, clickety, clickety, click, you're down the rabbit hole, as I'm sure we've all experienced. So what turned my retroactive fury about the movies killing vaudeville into my next book was that I found out some very interesting things, mainly under the category of no one was really paying attention. So to begin, I'm going to start with an incredibly selective and simplified version, history of the early movie industry. In the late 1880s, a number of companies were developing cameras, movie cameras. One of them was a French company called Gaumont, and they were trying to, develop and sell their cameras. And they had a secretary. Her name was Elise Guy Blanchet. And as far as we know, Elise is the first person in the history of the world to say, hey, wait a minute, instead of just filming things that are actually happening, like a horse galloping or people coming out of a factory, let's use these little gadgets to create a story. So she went to her boss and made the suggestion, and he said, okay, go ahead and try it, but don't let it get in the way of your secretarial duties. So this is Elise Guy Blanchet behind the camera. Elise goes off and she whips up a little 1-minute gem called the Cabbage Fairy. 1 minute long. The entire story is where babies come from, and it basically involves a woman in a little fairy costume pulling live naked babies out of fake cabbages. That's the whole thing. Elise goes on to make 400 more films. She moves to America, sets up her own studio. By the end of her career, has written, directed, or produced over 1,000 films. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Here, across the pond in the Northeast, we have Thomas Alva Edison. He too has developed a camera called the kinetoscope. Actually, he did not develop it. It was somebody who worked for him. Edison was a super shrewd business guy, and he hired great people, and then he would then take out the patent under his company. He also was smart enough to know that the movie industry was going to get bigger and bigger. And he really wanted to control the industry. He wanted to make as much money out of it as he could. And so he set up a trust of companies to control who could use his patents, which today we know is completely illegal, and it was eventually found to be so. But until then, he had his trust of companies, and if you were an independent filmmaker with your own, with your camera, he would hire thugs to go out to where you were filming. There you are, filming. Thug comes over, breaks your camera. So that was a big bummer. Most of the movie industry was on the East Coast in predominantly New Jersey and New York. So meanwhile, across the country in Southern California, it's incredibly sunny, and there are no blizzards, and there is no rain, and it's a lot easier to make movies when it's sunny out. Now, just an incredibly simplified and selective history of Hollywood. It was originally inhabited by native peoples called the Gabrielinos. Then a couple of farmers moved in and named it Cahuenga Valley. And then the big event was that Harvey and Daida Wilcox, H.H. Wilcox, bought up 160 acres, and they lived in Ohio. And they decided they were going to come and live in California. They bought up this little nowhere place. And on the train ride across the country, Daida started chatting with a woman who said that her home was called Hollywood. And Daida liked the sound of that, and so she said, "We're gonna call this Hollywood." And their idea was that this little town, nowhere town of Hollywood, California, would be an alcohol-free Christian utopia. They gave away free lots to Christian churches, and they wanted it to be a model of temperance, piety, and propriety. And as you can imagine, that didn't really work out quite as planned. So here is This was 1883. Here is Hollywood, California in 1896. And this road down here would become Hollywood Boulevard. In the back, we have the Santa Monica Mountains, so we're sort of facing north. This is what it looked like in 1896. But remember California sunshine, and remember Thomas Edison and his thugs. And it costs a lot of money to send thugs 3,000 miles away to break cameras, so mostly he doesn't. In 1910, D.W. Griffith, who was a very famous director, he filmed what we believe is the first film ever to be filmed in Hollywood. It was called In Old California, 1910. It was a one-reeler. So one reel of film was 15 minutes, give or take, depending on how fast you cranked the camera, literally. So his was 17. And a year later, in 1911, the Nestor Film Company came out to this town, this little town, and set up shop at the dusty corner of Sunset Boulevard and Gower, and many more soon followed. So in 1923, 27 years later after this picture, same basic perspective, we have that. So little nowhere Hollywood, California burgeoned with movie people. You can see the Hollywood land sign in the back. It was originally put up, it has 2,040 watt bulbs. And it was put up as basically an advertisement for Hollywood land real estate development. It was supposed to come down in 18 months. It didn't. And it was just stayed up there until the 1940s when the town of Hollywood took it over. And they took down land because they wanted to represent the city/town and not the real estate development. So that's just a little tangent about the Hollywood land sign. So back to talking about movies and how no one was really paying attention or taking it seriously, except, of course, the filmmakers themselves. And why that's so important. So in these early years, flickers, as they were called, because they flickered against the screen, they were considered fluff. Mostly 15 minutes. They were often used as filler in a vaudeville show. Some act doesn't show up, and they pop in a flicker. But it was not considered respectable work, and it was also you could watch an hour's worth of flickers at an aptly named Nickelodeon for a nickel. That's where the term Nickelodeon came from, because you could watch those films for a nickel. They were generally sort of rustic little theaters, and they were mostly patronized by poor people. If you didn't have the 25 cents to go to a vaudeville show, you might go to a Nickelodeon. And they were very particularly great for people who were illiterate, because they were, they didn't have, you could understand the entire story, and or if you were an immigrant. And immigration from the 1880s through 1920, 20 million immigrants came to our shores. The population went up by 15%. So there's a lot of immigrants, and they liked silent movies because they could understand what was going on. So again, the flickers were kind of like for poor people. So even as these one-reelers started growing into 2 and 5 and 10-reelers, and directors like Cecil B. DeMille and Lois Weber, who we'll talk about in a moment, were really perfecting the craft of filmmaking, and the movies were getting better. It was still considered not respectable. So if you were looking for a job, certainly you did not want your son or daughter to go into the flickers. But if you were sort of shut out of mainstream employment in America because of your gender or because of your religion, Hollywood beckoned. So each chapter in the book starts with a quote from a famous silent movie star or a silent movie maker, except for chapter 1, and that is a quote from a preeminent early Hollywood historian, Carrie Beecham, and she had this to say, and this really grabbed my attention. Hollywood was built by women and Jews. Those people were not allowed in respectable professions. It was not taken seriously as a business, so women and Jews could get into it. So here's what kind of started me warming to the idea of the silent movies. One of the things that I learned was, despite the fact that in the rest of America, women could basically get jobs as teachers, nurses, secretaries, telephone operators. Not a lot of job opportunities. In Hollywood, they were in every aspect of filmmaking, from plasterer molder, which was set construction, all the way up to studio chief. Actors were pretty popular, but the real stars were actresses. So Mary Pickford was America's sweetheart. She was one of the highest paid actors, male or female, throughout the teens and 20s. She was also one of the founding members of United Artists, which is a studio that still exists today. It's quite successful. And she and her husband, Douglas Fairbanks, D.W. Griffith, and Charlie Chaplin were the 4 founding members of United Artists because they were not happy with how they were being treated by their studios, so they created their own. And the 3 guys all agreed that Mary was the best business person among them. In 1916, the highest salaried director, male or female, was Lois Weber. She was just as famous as D.W. Griffith and Cecil B. DeMille, and she was making an unprecedented $5,000 a week, which in today's dollars would be about $122,000 a week. She pioneered film techniques like the split screen. This is Suspense, 1915.
Did you say a week?
A week.
Okay.
And where $5,000 a year would have been big dough back then. This is Suspense, 1915, and it's really pretty good. It was pretty suspenseful. And she also pioneered the mirror shot. By comparison, in 2018, of the 100 top grossing films, women directed 4. Half of all screenplays produced before 1925 were written by women, and that's compared to 15% in 2018. For 20 years, the highest paid, most highly sought after screenwriter, male or female, was Frances Marion. She's the only woman to have won Best Screenplay, an Oscar for Best Screenplay twice. The first time for the Big House in 1930, and the second time for The Champ in 1931, starring a very young Jackie Cooper. Look how cute he was. So cute. So you may be interested to know why women's influence started to wane in 1925. And that was because, or around the mid-20s, that was because movies were getting better. And they were getting more complicated, and the directing was better, and all of it was getting better, and a wider audience was going to them, including wealthy people were starting to go to the movies. Movies started making money, and so guys started edging the women out. And I know none of you guys here would do that, but back then, guys were maybe not quite so woke. So as for Jews, anti-Semitism was absolutely the norm in the early 1900s. It wasn't even a thing. It was just how Jews were treated. And guys like the Warner Brothers and Sam Goldwyn and Irving Thalberg really struggled against the odds in mainstream America because of this prejudice. But out in Hollywood, there was no one denying them entrance at the gate because there was no gate. Many of them grew up in poverty with a sort of a deep sense of their own outsiderness. But in Hollywood, they were the insiders, and they were influencing and interpreting the American dream through their movies. Irving Thalberg, incredibly successful guy. He's here with his silent film star wife, Norma Shearer. At the age of 20, he became the head of production at Universal Pictures. And then he became really co-partners with Louis B. Mayer at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer at a very young age. And he was called the boy wonder for the high quality and bankability of his films. So I have kids in their 20s, and I'm very proud of them. But I always like to think about Mrs. Thalberg, like, my Irving is the head of production. I mean, that's hard to beat, right? That's good cocktail patter. So women and Jews, two groups who were really discriminated against in mainstream America, were creating the dreams that America dreamed. This quote by Irving Thalberg is a little off topic, but it's one of my favorites in the whole book. Oops, sorry. If it isn't for the writing, we've got nothing. Writers are the most important people in Hollywood, and we must never let them know it. You can imagine why I like that one. So also in the category of nobody really paying attention, was that in the rest of America, it was a very sort of post-Edwardian sense of propriety. People followed the rules, but in Hollywood, the rules were very breakable. So if you wanted to drink during Prohibition, which ran from 1920 to 1933, no problem. Hollywood parties were epic. If you wanted to sleep with someone to whom you were not legally wed, or if you wanted to have a romantic attachment with someone who was either too much like you, as in your same gender, or not enough like you, as in not your same race, mum's the word. So one of my favorite examples of this is William Haynes, who was a very successful silent and then even talkies movie star. He was tall, dark, handsome, and openly gay. And he was living with his boyfriend, Jimmy Shields, for about 7 years before Louis B. Mayer called him on the carpet and said, "You're not being discreet enough. You can do what you want as long as you're being discreet. You're not being discreet enough. We're going to marry you off." So this was called the Lavender Marriage, and it was actually rather common. So it would be a gay man with a lesbian, 2 stars, and they would get married and pose for the pictures for the movie magazines and then go about their business. Billy Haynes, however, told Louis B. to go jump at a lake. He was not giving up his boyfriend, and he quit the movie industry. He became an interior designer to the stars, including his very good friend, Joan Crawford. And he continued to live with his beloved for the next 40 years. And in fact, William Haynes Interior Designs is still a company that exists today. It's very high end, and it's a big deal. So you may have heard of the pre-code era in Hollywood, and that refers to the Motion Picture Production Code of 1930. The code was really a backlash against the immoral ways of Hollywood and its pictures. And so I found a passage that was a part of a sermon that was given by a Hollywood pastor, and I used it in the book. And it goes like this. At the Methodist Church on Hollywood Boulevard, the pastor railed against the film industry as a community of jazzers, whose only interest was in eating and drinking and wearing clothes and more clothes and less clothes and more jewels and trying to drive faster and seeking hungrily for fresh sensations and bizarre things. They are moral lepers, lounge lizards, mashing parasites, and lipsticked women. So there was a huge tension between sort of moral America and Hollywood and its films, and that was really because Hollywood films were pretty risque. So the code had prohibitions on nudity, suggestive dances, superfluous use of liquor, ridicule of religion, lustful kissing, and scenes of passion, among other things. None of these things could any longer be in movies. Scenes of passion? What are we going to put in the movies, And that was because the early movies, silent movies, had all of these things. So there's a movie that I used in the book, The Queen of Sheba. One of the main characters is an extra on the movie. It was 1921. And this is Betty Blythe as the Queen of Sheba. Look closely. Not much between her and the camera. Yeah, quite thin. So here's what she had to say. This is one of the quotes in the book. "I had 28 costumes in that film, and if I'd worn them all at once, I couldn't have kept warm." So Hollywood in the early 1920s was really one big free-flowing, tolerant party if you made it. But if you didn't make it, or you hadn't made it yet, it could be very dangerous. It was a very gritty place. And one of the issues was that, young women in America were starting to think, hey, maybe I don't want to be a nurse, teacher, telephone operator, or secretary. Maybe I want to do something different. There's not a lot of opportunity out there, but I could be in the movies. and they would get on trains and they would go directly to the movie studios and they would register as extras. But of course, there were way too many of them to be absorbed into the industry, and some of them were taken advantage of, and some of them were forced to resort to unfortunate means to support themselves. So, and another huge problem was drugs and alcohol were incredibly available in Hollywood. One of the things that I found incredibly fascinating and also disturbing was the history of heroin. So heroin was developed in the late 1800s by the Bayer Aspirin Company. And it was thought to be a non-addictive derivative of morphine. So all the benefits of morphine, not addictive. Sounds silly, right?
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, but it's not. But it was. So it was really available to people. They marketed it as heroin, and it was on drugstore shelves. Okay, honey, stop by the drugstore on your way home and pick up a bottle of heroin. Sure, dear. Literally, it was in cough syrup because heroin suppresses breathing, so it makes you cough less. It was also in teething serum. So mothers were putting it on their teething serum, yes. So by 1914, the addictive nature of heroin had become clear, and so it was only available through a doctor's prescription. But in Hollywood, there were plenty of doctors who were willing to prescribe heroin. In fact, the studios often had doctors who, there were very few stunt people. Most actors did their own stunts. So actors were often getting hurt. And if an actor had some sort of injury which kept him or her from continuing their film, they could be shot up with heroin. Oh, la-di-da, they can go about doing their film. But it was not, several very well-known examples of big stars who became addicts and didn't survive, Wallace Reed being one of them. In 1924, the Heroin Act made heroin, cocaine, and morphine illegal, but people could still get it, as we know. So in response to this rising crisis of these young women, there was something put together called the Hollywood Studio Club. So a couple of the studios bought up a big house. They could house 20 people, 20 young women in it, and these were Hollywood hopefuls. They could get room and board for $10.50 a week, and also acting classes, performance classes, singing, dancing, acting. The patronesses were Mary Pickford and Cecil B. DeMille's wife, Constance. Of course, 20 beds is sort of a drop in the bucket. So in 1926, the studios all got together and pitched in for a new building that was to be overseen by the YWCA, 100 beds, still a drop in the bucket, but better than nothing. And some famous young Hollywood hopefuls who stayed there were Donna Reed, Barbara Eden, Rita Moreno, and Marilyn Monroe, who posed for nude pictures, apparently to pay her rent. I started to really, I was so interested by all this fascinating research. I started to watch silent movies, and as much as I thought that they would be sort of hammy and primitive, and some of them were fantastic. Some of them were really dramatically good and complex. They didn't have words, but they did have intertitles, sort of cards. And some of the dialogue was actually really pretty snappy. So I picked one that I really liked. Don't mind him, he has an open mind that's temporarily closed for repairs. That's Marion Davies and the Patsy. And some of the stories were really primitive. Some of them are rather complex. Louise Brooks in the Pandora's Box, really quite a good film. Some of them were, some of the acting was a bit over the top, and some of it was incredibly subtle. Charlie Chaplin, incredibly subtle. Also Mary Pickford. So one of the first movies I watched was A Little Princess. It was an adaptation of A Little Princess. 1917, and Mary Pickford plays Sarah Cruz. She lives in India with her dad, and he's in the military, and things are heating up, so he brings her to England, puts her in English boarding school, and this is their goodbye scene, and she's waving goodbye to him. And I'm watching this film thinking, and I got choked up. I was like, oh my gosh, she did such a great job. Her father goes off to India and dies. It's a terribly sad story, but it sort of picks up in the end. But I was so impressed by that. Mary Pickford was playing an 11-year-old girl, and she was 25, and she really sold it. It was great. So, along with being a pretty wild place with no rules and a lot of glamour and grit, but where the stakes were precipitously high, Hollywood was cranking out some pretty great films, and that's what grabbed me and made me want to write a story about it. So, City of Flickering Light is a story about three friends. They are all, page one, working for a burlesque show, a particularly sort of brutal burlesque show. The two girls are dancers and the guy is a comedian. And they decide that they have to get away from this burlesque show and jump off a train in Flagstaff. And they make their way to Hollywood and, try their darndest to get their toes in the studio doors. And they face a lot of they face poverty and abuse and anti-Semitism and all kinds of sexism and all kinds of things. But their friendship is really what sort of holds them together. And I like to say that even though it's really about a fascinating time and a fascinating place, it's also very much about friendship. So, if you happen to have read The Tumbling Turner Sisters, I will tell you that one of the Turner sisters becomes a secondary character in this story, so you will get to find out what happened to her. And I will also just mention that if you are in a book group and you choose The City of Flickering Light or any of my books, and you want me to Skype in when you meet to talk about it, I would be happy to do that. That's actually really fun for me. Especially one of the things I really like about it is that I only have to dress from the waist up. I can wear pajamas or yoga pants and just a little lipstick and a nice shirt, you're good to go. And for the last thing I will tell you is that I have a newsletter. Then we're going to go to questions, so start thinking about your questions. I have a newsletter that you do not have to sign up for. There's no reason for you to sign up for this newsletter unless you really want to. I do not send it out very often. My publisher would like me to send it out more often than I do. So it will not clog your inbox, and I will not sell your email address because I don't know how. And I also wouldn't because that's not nice. But if you do decide to sign up for my lovely little email, you will be in the running for, I should have had this handy, for the big reveal, a bottle of City of Flickering Light nail polish in Hollywood Red. So my publisher did that for me. I thought it was pretty cool. So pass that around while we chat. So what questions or comments do you have? Yes.
I kept thinking about TCM.
Oh yeah, Turner Classic Movies. Yes.
Yeah, I could see you there, talking on TV.
You could see me doing. I would love that. Actually, one of the things that's interesting is I think Turner Classic Movies is showing silent films, and also what's really interesting is that silent movie retrospectives are popping up in various places. Like you can go and they'll have like the musical score that goes along with it, so that there'll be somebody playing the piano that sort of amps up the drama, just like musical scores do today. So it's been really very cool to see that I'm not the only person in America interested in silent films. And one of the things that is kind of sad is that they think something like 70% of all silent films have been lost. Because, for a couple of reasons. One, in 1927, the first talkie film came out. It was about 18 to 24 months before the whole industry had flipped over into talkies. So silent films were not valuable anymore, they thought. So they junked them. Or they kept them, but they were often made out of nitrate film, and they were very flammable. So some of them went up in flames. But we still do have some. We don't have Queen of Sheba. I would love to see that. That would be really fun. I was only able to find stills for it. So lots.
Queen of Sheba doesn't exist?
I don't think it does. Well, not that we know, unless sometimes people sort of hoard them, collectors or that kind of thing. We have a lot of Charlie Chaplin. We have a lot of Mary Pickfords. The big stars, those were kept, but a lot of little ones have gone the way of the dodo, unfortunately.
Around what year was it that Charlie Chaplin did he start, phasing out the silent ones into the?
It was late. I think it was late in the 30s. Charlie Chaplin was like the last holdout.
Yeah.
He really believed in silent films. A lot of them did. Lillian Gish really thought that, silent movies was its own separate art form. And they wanted to keep doing silent films. Charlie Chaplin was unbelievable in what he could convey very subtly with his face. So I can understand why he wanted to, and The Little Tramp was his big character. So The Little Tramp speaks, that's weird, right? So some of them really hung on. But I'm sure many of you have seen Singing in the Rain, which was about the transition to the talkies and how some of them made it and a lot of them didn't. And there was that one beautiful blonde who said, "I can't stand it." And that's your career's over. Yeah. Yes.
You talked a lot about your research. Can you talk a little bit about the development of your story? Did you have a story idea before you did all this research?
Oh, sure. Well, so one of the things that I like to do with historical fiction is sort of get a sense of, and I did this with vaudeville too, like, let me get my arms around this idea. What was going on? What was I need to learn more about it. And then sort of figure out who are the characters that are going to tell this story for me. And I really, my characters are fictional. They're not really based on, the main characters, not really based. Some of the secondary characters are absolutely based on real people. But the main characters are not based on real people. And I wanted them to be the people that would tell this story. So when I learned about how women and Jews they couldn't get into mainstream jobs, but they could in Hollywood, I knew that I wanted my main characters to be two women and a Jewish man. So that was sort of how. So what I did was about 3 months of just research. Didn't write a word. Just let me absorb and sort of sink myself into this world of early Hollywood. What was going on in the world politically? Sort of what was happening, and then over that time, the story ideas start to bubble up until I sort of home in on, okay, I want this and this and this to happen. Excuse me, sorry. So these are the characters that will sort of tell that story the best. Thank you for that question. Yeah. Yes?
Have you spent a lot of time yourself out in Hollywood?
Not a lot of time, but I did go out to Hollywood. Wow, this is cool. So dramatic. All we need are like the flashing lights, right? So I did go out to Hollywood. Unfortunately, there's not a lot left there. Hollywood's been repaved over numerous times. There are a few things still left. There's the Hollywood Heritage Museum, which has Cecil B. DeMille's office and the barn that he shot a lot of stuff in, and like a weird collection of like stuff from Rudolph Valentino, and so that I went to. The Hollywood Museum is in the old Max Factor building, and again, a weird collection of like the dress from this movie and the shoes from this movie and old movie cameras and stuff. Very cool stuff. It was fun. I really got a chance to nerd out on old Hollywood. And I went to dinner at Musso and Frank, which was there. It was built in 1919. Had the first phone in Hollywood, and the phone booth is still there. And they absolutely serve food like liver and onions and stuff like that. But what's very cool, so I had dinner with a friend there, and what's really fun is that occasionally you'll see, a movie or a TV show, and they're having dinner at Musso and Frank because it was a really big Hollywood hangout. So that was really fun. I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. My friend was like, what's this place again? I'm like, no, it's cool. So liver and onions, really? But yeah, it was fun. Yeah. Yes?
A lot of the producers and maybe owners of the companies and actors were from Russia.
Yes.
Russian Jews.
Yes.
And a lot of them were that communist, socialists had that bent. there was a...
Well, actually, I'm gonna challenge you a little bit on that. One of the things that I really found in my research was that a lot of these guys came from other countries, Sam Goldwyn and Adolf Zukor, and a lot of, the Warner Brothers. Well, I can't remember their original names, but they sort of Americanized their names for obvious reasons. It was amazing how important it was for them to make movies that were patriotic and that were America, America the Beautiful and Mom, Apple Pie and baseball. I mean, they really had this sense of wanting to portray America, not just to Americans, but to the world, as this land of opportunity where the, good guy wins and that kind of thing. And, some people have sort of said they're like more patriotic than people who were born here. And it was very interesting how much of an impact that desire to love America had on the movies and thus on sort of the American mentality of who we think we are. Came from a lot of these guys who weren't born here.
Irving Burley and God Bless America.
There's a lot, it's very interesting.
I was thinking of the McCarthy.
Well, yes. I mean, there were yes, not so much the studio heads, but certainly there were actors and, who were, well, there's a lot of people who were thinking about a lot of things about how, and then McCarthyism came in and that was not okay anymore, for sure, yeah. That was later, though.
He starred a lot of very patriotic
Absolutely, yes, he did. He started in vaudeville, by the way.
Oh,
He did, yep.
wow.
Yes.
Can you tell us about the time span of your story?
Sure. So our three friends, who I think remarkably kind of look like these people, because that's not always the case with book covers, as we know. They don't always really represent the book as much as we like. They get to Hollywood in 1921, and they struggle for quite a bit. The story runs about a year and a half into 1922, so it sort of covers what was going on in Hollywood at the time.
After the First World War?
Yes, after the First World War, yeah. What made you ask that question?
Well, I don't know. I'm just looking at the three individuals. Did you choose that picture?
Well, I sort of chose it. I mean, authors have very much less control over the covers than people like to think we do. They showed me a couple of really bad, am I being filmed here? Yes. Really bad covers, and I don't care. Really bad covers, and I was like, no, this isn't going to work. And then they showed me this one. This was like an outtake. This is not, and it was black and white. And I said, well, I think if we colorize it, sort of the way that, it'll pop a little bit. And I actually really like it. I think it's, I will tell you that it was, I think it was a modeling session on the beach. And then they superimposed the Hollywood Hills behind it. That's what you can do with Photoshop. Yeah. Yeah.
Were you a film buff before you started this project?
I've always loved the movies, but I wouldn't have called myself a film buff. Now I feel like I am a little bit of a nerd about it, for sure. Certainly silent films, which is kind of a small club. But no, I didn't. What grabbed me was more this sort of interesting social thing that was happening where, we think of the movies now as being so powerful and people, making so much money and that kind of thing. Back then, it was really kind of, many people thought of it as a fad. And so then you have these sort of outsiders that can get in. And the movies that Lois Weber was creating incredible movies. Many of them had sort of a social justice kind of bent to them. She was talking about poverty and women's issues and stuff like that. I mean, she really had a lot of control that women still don't have, never got back, really. I mean, I'm hopeful that things are changing. I think we're sort of getting into a little bit of an upsurge, but we'll see.
And do you see yourself leaving this world entirely, or is there another project in the future that's Hollywood?
I do have another book that I have started. So I have a question that I ask everybody. Whenever that question comes up, I always have to ask this question first. Has anybody here heard of the Harvey Girls? You have, okay, not many, but so for those of you who don't know, in the mid-1800s when the trains were being, all the railroad tracks were going west, the Santa Fe Railroad had basically the Southwest. And they had a guy working for them named Fred Harvey. And one of the things that Fred noticed, he was kind of a foodie, he noticed that people, there were stops about every 100 miles because the trains had to have coal and water. And that's where people would eat. And sometimes the food was so bad they would die. Literally, it was terrible. It was very hard to get across the country. You couldn't pack enough food for yourself. It was awful. So he goes to the railroad and he said, "I have this great idea. You let me develop restaurants along the tracks. You give me the right of way to do this. You pay to ship in food." He really liked to do it well, and I will make train riding a much more pleasant experience for your passengers. They'll want to do it more. Boy, was he right. What happened when he first started it was that he had waiters. Men were waiters. Waitresses were considered very floozies. They were a step above prostitution in the late 1800s in terms of, they were below domestic workers and factory workers in the social status. You did not want your daughter to be a waitress. And so but the problem that Fred Harvey was having was that his waiters were getting drunk and breaking things. So one of his managers said, "Why don't you bring some women in here?" And this was like, boof, what a big idea. So what he decided to do was he would have women as waitresses, but he would dress them extremely conservatively, almost like nuns. They had a strict code of conduct. They had to live in dorms. They could only date who the manager said they could date. It was very much like, you will not be the stereotype of waitresses. They could not be called waitresses. They were Harvey girls. So this sounds like a very constrained life, right? Except girls came in from all around the country. He paid them very well. So many of them were the top earners in their families, and they would send the money back. He also made it possible for them to travel, because he said you would work at a stint at one place for 6 months, and then you could have a week. You could travel anywhere the Santa Fe went. You could eat at another Harvey house. It was like college for a lot of these girls who were never going to get to college, because it was dorms and they learned from each other, and they really learned a lot about sort of more upper class, because it was all white tablecloths and silverware. So it was a really mostly great experience for the girls themselves. And what also grabbed me was that the Southwest was mostly men. It was ranchers and prospectors and railroad men, and it was guys. And then suddenly there's this influx of young women into the Southwest, 100,000 of them over the course of 1880s to 1950s. And many of them stayed and got married. And Fred Harvey is credited with populating the Southwest. There were many babies named either Fred or Harvey, many, thousands. So it's such a great backdrop for a story, right? Pick some girls and figure out where they're going to go. And, I've really been having a good time with it. So that's fun.
How did you find out about that?
I found out, thank you for that question, I found out about the Harvey girls because I was researching how my 3 friends here were going to jump off a train, and when did the next train go, and they were going through Barstow, and there's a Harvey house there. What's a Harvey house? Oh my gosh, another internet rabbit hole that I ended up spending an afternoon on. And as soon as I heard about it, as soon as I learned what Harvey girls were, I was like, that's my next book. So there you go.
Wow.
Yeah.
From Tumbling Turner Sisters, City of Flickering Lights.
Right. One story has sort of, I've learned something new, and I think I want to explore that more. One of the things that a writer has to do is really love their subject matter, because when you think about it, a book takes at least a year to write. Most of my friends don't write a book a year. Sometimes it takes 10 years to write. You have to really want to stay with that idea for a long time. So it has to be something that really grabs you. And it's so often, authors say this all the time, somebody will come up to you and say, "I got a story for you." And you think, that's great, but that's your story. You should write that story. I got something and I'm, really enthusiastic about. So that's, yes.
You did a lot of research and you chose these 3 characters, but how did you decide what the story was going to be about?
So I chose the characters, and what did I decide the story was going to be about? So I took some of the concepts that I learned about, and some of the things that were happening at the time, like the Fatty Arbuckle scandal, where Fatty Arbuckle was accused of raping and murdering this girl, and it's a very famous case, and it really ruined his career. I wanted to talk about how, the movies came into Hollywood, and you would think it was like this great, they were making money and all that kind of thing, but the people who lived in Hollywood hated it. And there were signs all over the place that said, no Jews, no dogs, no actors. And sort of what it was like to try and what did extras do all day long? So I was learning all these things, and I used the story as a way to sort of explore some of the experiences that many Hollywood hopefuls did have at the time, and then also sort of what was going on in Hollywood at the time. And that sort of gave me my landmarks. But I also have to say that I know writers are often put sort of on a spectrum of plotters who plot everything out. Now, everybody, I know what's going to happen in every chapter from 1 to 50, and pantsers who fly by the seat of their pants. Hey, I know, I'm going to write a story about Hollywood. Tappity tap. I am sort of in the middle. I know what I think the landmarks will be. I know I want to talk about this. I know I want to talk about this. I think this is where we'll end up. But sometimes that changes. And I'm writing the story and I'm learning more about the characters as I write them. And I'm thinking, well, she wouldn't do that. So now I got to figure out something else, So that it's a creative process all along. And sometimes I am surprised, and I kind of like that. It's like, what's going to happen now? I know where I want to go, but how are we going to get there? That part of it's fun for me, I have to say. Yeah.
Do you have someone that you can bounce things off of? Because it's like you must have to talk to yourself to figure out where it's going to go. I
do a lot of talking to myself. It's true. I live in a world with my imaginary characters. It's true. In my yoga pants, But I do have a writers group, and they're great. And writers groups I would really recommend for anybody who wants to write, because it is great to have somebody to bounce things off of. In our group, we tend to write most of it, or we'll write a half of it and then show it to the group. And then the group will come and say, well, this doesn't make sense, or I don't really understand why this is happening, or she's boring. We are kind but honest with each other, because you need that. I mean, why bother if you're all just going to say this is wonderful? So it is really important. I also have an agent. She'll read anything that I read that I write before I send it anywhere. And I have an editor. But the editor is sort of the last stop. You want to have all your ducks in a row before you show anything to an editor. I will say, though, that this editor I've been with for a couple of books now. I was with her for the Tumbling Turner Sisters and the City of Flickering Light. And my agent said, I think you should show her what you've got on the Harvey Girls. I think you should show her. And I was like, really? Are you sure? So I did, and she was really excited about it. And she had ideas, and so that was great to sort of get her in. That's the first time I've had the editor in on the process early on. So that was kind of fun. Thank you for that question.
So it'll probably make a very good movie.
Oh, from your lips to God's ears. That's what we hope. So there's a little bit of interest out there. We'll see what happens. I have heard, and I don't know how true this is, but it's probably pretty true, that I don't know how many books get optioned for TV or movies. Very, very few. Very, very few. And that of the books that do get optioned, 10% of them actually get made. So optioning is fun, but you're probably still not going to get there. There's so many stars that have to align, no pun intended, for a movie or a series or anything to happen. It's really pretty remarkable. So, but we can dream.
I was going to ask that question actually. When you're working on a project, do some of them seem more suitable for a film adaptation to you?
Yes, I do. I mean, I have to say, I think when I'm writing, I think very visually, and so I could see anything made into a movie. And when I'm reading other people's books, I'm seeing how that could be put together visually. But it's absolutely true. Some books are more cinematic than others. I'm going to say that City of Flickering Light, I may be biased, but it could make a pretty good movie because it's about the movies. Yeah.
That's a great title, too.
Thank you. I will tell you where I got the title for that. I was watching La La Land And there is a song, City of Stars. And I thought, I can't really rip that off, but how about City of Flickering Light? And everybody liked it, so that was good.
It's a good time.
Yeah, thank you. Was there another? Yes.
Now I can't.
Do you want me to sing City of Flickering Stars? City of Stars. I'm sorry.
I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that there's a movie, The Harvey Girls,
There-
possibly with Judy Garland.
Yes, exactly right. There is a movie called The Harvey Girls with Judy Garland, 1947, I'm going to say. The song from that is The Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe, won the Academy Award. Do you want me to sing for you? I'm not going to. And it was not terribly representative, much like most of, of what was really like to be a Harvey girl. Is very romantic and fluffy, and it was great. But yes, that's how most people know about the Harvey Girls. That's how people outside of the Southwest know about the Harvey Girls. So you're right about that.
Speaking of women need to get together and take books like yours and make movies that the normal channels won't.
I would love to have that happen. I'm available. I'm available. My books are available. Thank you.
I just a little. You had Rudolph Valentino there.
Yes.
I don't know how many people have seen him in a silent movie. He's devastating.
Oh, it's so true. So she's saying that Rudolph Valentino is devastating. I saw him in his first film where he really got is the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and he's kind of a bad guy. He is so handsome and sexy. And I was like, wow, silent movie. I was like, he just knew he was a really good dancer, and he sort of had the moves, and he was completely overwhelmed by his stardom. He had been like driving a cab basically, and he really struggled because it was just so overwhelming. And then he tragically died, I believe, of peritonitis from a botched appendectomy. And tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of women lined up. It was like one of the first really big people from everywhere came for this funeral and wanted to see him, the last moments of, really pretty amazing. Yeah.
Is that the one where he does the tango?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Right? Wow.
A tragic note, my mother grew up in Brooklyn.
Oh.
And a friend of hers committed suicide when he died.
Oh
my God.
Wow, I had heard that there were several women who committed suicide wow, that brings it home. One of the things that's at the Hollywood Heritage Museum is this whole thing on Rudolph Valentino and how crazy it was around his death, and that several women killed themselves. It's really pretty. What was very interesting is that the movie stars, that stardom thing was very new. So you had stars of the stage, but only a certain number of people can fit in a theater. You can only, 100, several, 1,000 people can sit in the theater. Movies were being shown at the same time all over America, and as we do, and you're seeing, when you're sitting in a seat, even if you're in the front row, that person's pretty far away. Movies brought people, these actors' faces, the trickle of tears down the film, the longing smile, and people weren't used to that, and so they really got attached, and they felt like they knew that this was my friend. So I wrote a piece about the first movie star, who was Florence Lawrence, and she was called the Biograph Girl. Early on, they did not want stars to be named. They didn't want you to know who they were because they knew if hey, Juliette Fay, she's really, so great, I'm going to start asking for more money. I am. So they tried to keep the identities of the stars like it's just a stock, the stock group. So Florence Lawrence was starting to be called the Biograph Girl because she was in all these Biograph movies. Biograph was a pretty big company back then. And people would write to the studio and say, who is the Biograph Girl? Who is she? And she wanted to be named because she wanted to make more money, and they wouldn't do it. So she went to another company, and she had all these trouble. Carl Laemmle, who was a very big studio chief, he took her on, and he set up this whole ruse where he named her, and then he told I think it was the St. Louis Dispatch, that she had been killed by a streetcar. It was really like all of this was made up, much of Hollywood, like reality TV shows. And then he puts a big poster, a big ad in the paper saying, "We nail a lie. Some other studio has claimed that she died which doesn't make any sense. Like, she's not, why that would ruin her career, it wouldn't." So it was clearly him. And then and people were in a frenzy about this, because really this was the first time this experience was happening for people. So then they had her make a public appearance, like an in-person appearance, and people are pulling the buttons off her jacket and her hat. It was like mayhem, because this was this new phenomenon in the human experience of stars and how much we feel like we know them. And then we find out he's nothing like that good guy I fell in love with, I mean, Rudy Valentino was kind of, he was really sexy, but he was not that smart, and he was way in over his head with the stardom stuff. So pretty interesting. Anyway, I know I'm nerding out on you guys. Sorry about that. Any other questions, or should we go directly to finding out who's going to win that nail polish? Did everybody get to sign up that wanted to? Are you sure? All right, you have an option. You can sign up and then give it to, so now you would have two choices. Okay, all right. Oh, are you two going to share? Is that what's going to happen? You're both going to? Okay. All right, so I need that, and I have a random number generator on my phone. This comes in really handy as a mom, like who gets the last pancake, and I would say, pick a number from 1 to 5, and whoever won, the other kid would inevitably say, you wanted him to have it. So then you get a random number generator, and you can say, no, it really was 3. So we will do this very quickly. 223. Okay, number 18 is Barbara Schiappa. Oh my gosh. Now you are going to get to use it.
I'll save it for a souvenir.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Wonderful to have you here.